Hey everybody, this is Ben Atkinson, and this is our interview series, Inspiring Leadership. This week is entitled Be Nice, Honest, and Prepared to be Tough. If you're watching, please do like, share, and if you're interested, post questions. It'd be great to hear from you. Jonathan, who are we interviewing this week?
Hello, Ben, and thank you for that. Welcome to my favourite time of the week. And as part of this series, we're very lucky to have Simon Brewer. Simon is a senior advisor at Rothschild and Co. He's also the co-founder of an excellent podcast I recommend you all listen to called MoneyMaze. And he's also the CEO of Vantage Investment Advisory Limited and chairman of Clifton College Development Club. And it sounds like the piece are after one of you, not me. And I think they're after Simon. But Simon, great to have you in the series. You were recommended by Johnny Gray, who went down very well, and you two go back a long way to Verbier. So welcome to the series.
Wow, it's a delight. Thank you very much for asking me.
Yeah, no, great having you here. And we were chatting earlier, and it was great to chat to you. A hell of a life you've had already, but very interested. By anybody's standard, you're massively successful. But how did life begin out? We're interested in the sort of life's transitions, the highs and the lows. But how did life shape you that make you the leader you are today? What were some of the few of the just key moments in your life as you were growing up?
Well, Jonathan, I think you're being far too nice to start with about some of these so-called accomplishments. So, but I'll take them. Thank you. Look, I was born and brought up in Bristol, and I have very happy memories of a childhood that was, full of love and fun. And my first job, I think, was Bristol Zoo when I was still at school and serving chips to the Welsh folks who came over from the Tynfil or something like that. See, and it was, it was sort of great. And those sort of jobs. And I know my father constantly telling me, well, if you want to get anywhere in life, you have to work hard. And I think that now having children, seeing my O-level results, which were an absolute car wreck, how I managed to scrape my way through A-levels that were just good enough to get me into the LSE somehow seems, I think it still is a mystery to my mother. But anyway, I did, and I had one of those gap years that, are much maligned or, at least become sort of a source of satire. But I remember I took my RCB exam because I thought I might want to go into the army, and then I went off and was a bellboy in Switzerland, which was just fantastic. I remember turning up at this very smart hotel in St. Moritz to be a bellboy, and I arrived at reception. The guy goes, good morning, how can I help you? I think he thought I was a guest, and I said, well, come here to work. And he said, the staff entrance is around the back of the hotel. So it was a rude awakening there, and then from there I worked in Cape Town as a waiter and traveled, and I pitched up at the LSE, and it was fantastic. It was fantastic because it was a great institution. It was fantastic because if you were politically motivated, you had the CND camp, you had Thatcher, her arrival was clearly polemic. I remember I brought Michael Heseltine onto stage once with a friend, because we were involved in the conservative group. Hopefully lots of people now don't click off your podcast. And I remember that the left-wing magazine then printed a photograph saying, the prince enters with the ladies in waiting. So I had a fantastic time. I thought, this is it, I'm going to be a politician. And then, of course, reality struck, which is, what are you going to do? And I will tell a short story because it was interview time, 1985. You weren't armed with any of the equipment people are today. And so I had a German flatmate who was incredibly, I thought, knowledgeable. And so we were both due to interview Goldman Sachs on campus. And Goldman's, wasn't really known, but it clearly was a job that might pay very well. So I said to him, what are you going to do if they ask you, what are you going to say when they ask you what you want to do? And he said, I've thought about this a lot. I'm going to tell them I want to do portfolio management for high net worth individuals. So I said, well, what does that mean? So he explains it to me. So I go into this interview. Two of the most beautifully dressed human beings I've ever seen in my life. They've flown over from New York. They're interviewing a whole list of people. So Simon, what would you like to do at Goldman's? So I said, well, I've thought about this quite a bit, and I'd like to do portfolio management for high net worth individuals. And there was a pause, and they said, we don't do that. And then there was another pause, and I said, I'm very flexible. And then there was another pause, and the interview ended. So I did not work at Goldman Sachs. The next paid job, which was half the amount Goldman's, was at Citibank, which was actually the right thing because it was a much gentler incubation. And I joined Citibank in 1985, and I started training out to be a portfolio manager. And you talk about leadership. There was a gentleman called Farhan Sharaf who sort of took me under his wing, give me, as the Americans, they gave me air cover, but he allowed me to make a ton of mistakes. And in that I was able to be both shielded and advanced. And it was great. And so 4 years later, I decided, same German guy who set me up at Goldman Sachs, actually then sitting on a plane said, well, you know what, you should join Morgan Stanley. It's a much greater opportunity. And one thing led to another. And I had my interviews at sort of, through Morgan Stanley. And I remember going to my final interview. I have never had sweaty palms, but I had sweaty palms, meeting this very high-powered executive from Morgan Stanley. And I got the job. And I went from a good job at Citibank to what could be a great job at Morgan Stanley, but it was to be a commission salesman. And that's so well known in the US as a route, but it is alien, of course, or somewhat alien in the UK culture. So you're given desk, phones, you had the gold-plated calling card, because Morgan Stanley was very well known in the US, less well known. I actually remember I had to build a client base. So I remember you would scour directories, you would scour lists, you would think who you could talk to. It was essentially for wealthy individuals. And I found these guys, a pair of brothers who had sold their meat pie business to Grand Metropolitan. And I called them up. It's what you did. You're not allowed to do that these days. But you call them and I said, hello, I'm calling from Morgan Stanley, and I wonder if I can speak to Mr. Davis. And she said, oh, Morgan Stanley, are you over in Newport then? So I said, well, we're in many places around the world, not actually Newport yet, but and I didn't win the business. But anyway, so I had very, very happy. It was 17 years, I think, at Morgan Stanley from 1989, and managed to dodge a lot of bullets. I think it was Churchill who said there's nothing more exhilarating than being shot at without being hit. Well, I think you're the soldier, I'm not, but I dodged a few things that might otherwise have ruined my career, and probably today would have done, inappropriate jokes and all that sort of thing. Anyway, so I ended up being the chief investment officer. It was a wonderful time, wonderful firm. Again, gave me and lots of other people fantastic opportunities. And then you sort of, I suppose, maybe I should be quiet now, Jonathan, but because I'm going to sort of overrun myself. But after that, I changed direction and started to do some other things. But I'll stop.
No, it's great, and it's lovely just hearing the humanity and the humility of it and the humour, which is three things we look for in our guests. You've brought them on already. I was thinking of your story there about the interview, and I remember when I went for an interview with, I was very excited to interview with McKinsey, even though I was quite late on leaving the army. I had McKinsey and PwC, and I got through 6 interviews with McKinsey. I was really chuffed myself, doing really well. And then they hit me with the live maths question. And of course, with someone who's got dyslexic and dyscalculia, even though I did pure and applied maths, I was stumped, literally stumped. And I blew out at that stage from McKinsey. But just the day before, can you hear me all right?
Well, I can, but I'm just, because I think my memory is so bad that I'll sort of forget to tell you this. But only that in terms of that interview, I'm going to just share one moment which taught me a lot. But I was there. We were interviewing graduates, MBAs actually, from around the world. And I was due to meet a guy who'd been was studying at Columbia. And I came into the room, and for some reason I was carrying a cup of coffee. I don't know why I was to an interview, but I was. And he was an American Greek guy, and he's very enthusiastic. And he said, hello, Simon, how are you? Shakes my hand so vigorously that the coffee goes right down my white shirt. And it was a moment that would have been a horror. And he paused. And he looked at me and he said, you know what they say? You never get a second chance to make a first impression. And we hired him because his ability to think on the feet and use humor was, to us, actually a great skill.
Oh, yeah. Well, those are the moments that stay with you. Well, I was thinking of the PwC interview, a bit like this one, was the day before, and the partner, I got so far to the final interview, and I think it went well. And she said, what happens if McKinsey, for your interview tomorrow, offer you twice as much as we would offer you? And without thinking, I said, well, I'd feel undervalued by you. And she said, like it, you're in. And it was just like that sort of thinking on your feet, like your friend with the So thanks. And Don McIntyre said, I can tell already this will be a hugely entertaining as well as informative. So thanks, Simon. Great having you on board already. So Ben, over to you. I've talked too much.
Yeah, so it's really good to sort of actually get to know you a bit, Simon, and I love that journey from Bristol and all the way through those sort of interesting career moves. But what are you doing now? What's the stuff that's that you are currently doing?
So to use that probably horrible word, I am plural, and that wasn't entirely the journey that I thought. I left Morgan Stanley. I bought into a small asset management business. We made it quite a large asset management business relative to the number of people. A couple of $100 million, took it to $1.5 billion, and managing money. Somebody once said, successful investing is a minority sport, and you can look heroic for quite a long time, and as even the great Warren Buffett's had, very disappointing performance at times, not in aggregate. Clearly, in aggregate, he's been absolutely fantastic. We had sort of tailwinds, and then we came through the great financial crisis really well, and then just got very defensive and hedging up. We put protection on because we just worried that this money printing and the reverberations, or I should say repercussions of the great financial crisis would run, and the debts had to be paid. But of course, that's not what has transpired. What's transpired is that even more debt creation has happened, and even more or further distance from orthodox financial policies has evolved to what we're seeing now. And I want to get into that, but we were the wrong guys for that. So we sort of essentially stood still when others kept going, and so the business which we'd really grown, to something that we're very pleased with, sort of started to reverse. It was the Duke of York's, and anyway, cut a long story short. That's, for anybody who's proud and has seen an empire grow, to see it go into reverse is, it's a unhappy experience, and it was. Clearly, you're sort of, you're soldiering on, and you're doing what Churchill said: KBO, keep buggering on. You're going into the office. You're trying to be jolly. Anyway, cut a long story short, it sort of became obvious that I shouldn't be full-time in that role, and so became increasingly looking for other things. A number of my colleagues had gone to Rothschild and Co in the UK, and they were people I was very fond of and liked and admired. And anyway, so I have this role as senior advisor where I try and help them where I can in various areas. I advise. I sit on a couple of advisory committees talking about asset allocation as a paid consultant. I do this. I say it's charity, but it is. I chair the Clifton College Development Trust. I'm very fond of and loyal to, and keen to help the school that helped me so much. And again, one or two teachers at a certain point in time absolutely were pivotal in allowing me to make that leap from, should we say, even sub-mediocrity to something a little better. And forever, I will be thankful for those two teachers. So in addition to that, so I'm chairman of that development trust, the governor of Clifton College, so I'm sort of quite involved in a number of things that we do around there. And then I have this venture, which you alluded to at the beginning, and I'm not going to use this as a commercial, but it's called the MoneyMaze Podcast. And a friend came to me, who's a city veteran as well, Will Campion, and said, there's this great show. It's called Capital Allocators in the US. They've got 2 million listeners. We should do this in Europe. And it's like, well, what do you mean we should do this in Europe? And he said, you, Simon, I think you should do the interview. I said, well, what a ridiculous idea. Anyway, here we are, 6 months in, and I am doing the interview. And it's fantastically exciting. We're in 80-something countries and nearly 20,000 listeners, and having people that we'd never imagined we would come and talk about, as you're doing, journey, but perspectives on investing, allocating capital, running businesses. And it's the new world, isn't it? We can make great progress. Now, Ben clearly here is the digital technological expert, and there is a recognition, Jonathan, I'm not going to put you in this camp, that there is a limit to old dogs and new tricks. So I'm very lucky, and Will and myself are very lucky that we've got a couple of fantastically young, brilliant people who are helping us hopefully now take this on. But yeah, reinvention, I mean, incredibly exciting.
Yeah, it's such a different thing than what you were doing before. And it must be really exciting and invigorating to be doing something new. Is there any piece of advice that you'd like to have given your young self starting out?
Well, we are limited by time, aren't we? So I think, there are times when I would say to my children, just be nice to everybody. I read a really interesting book, which I might come back to later on, but I'm going to paraphrase it. But on it, somebody said, well, my father told me that there's a sign on everybody's forehead, which is make me feel like a hero. And just sometimes I would look back and wish I'd be nicer to some people. I wish that every time I had sat on a plane or a train next to somebody, I had absolutely said hello and introduced myself and asked them how they were, rather than doing it sometimes. Shyness, there are no prizes for being shy. I do again, I'm full of these useless sort of idioms, but I say to my children, do you want to be a radiator or do you want to be a drain? Okay? Try and be sunny where possible. So I think to hear their story, not to judge too quickly, which is all part of the same thing. And now I look back and, data proliferates everywhere, but that's one thing having data and there's another thing managing it. And I wish I'd been better organized in my early life about keeping data. So when somebody goes, oh yeah, did you know so-and-so worked at Santander? I go, yeah, I did. And then you look and you go, oh, I got his card and then I threw it away, or I didn't, so no excuse, absolutely no excuse for not being really efficient. So look, I could go on, but those would be some of the ones that come to me quickly.
And it's traditionally, I mean, from the outside, the business that you work in, it's sometimes a bit cutthroat, probably not that easy to be nice all the time. So it's probably something to look back on, and I can understand that one. And I like your sort of rule of starting to have conversations in those situations. I started doing that at work, where the journey in the lift. And there'd be people that you've worked with for years and you've seen them in the lift maybe like 20 times and you haven't said hello. So I just started the rule that every time I was in the lift, I'd say hello to everybody. And it just increased my network within my own business, like massively. Simple thing, but.
And it's remarkable how you could be in that lift, and we've all done it. I mean, for a year, and then you think it's too late. It's like a thank you, but it's not, is it? And you go, no. I have been such an idiot. I have seen you and I've never said hello and introduced myself. And you know what? It's a ray of sunshine. And typically that person, unless they go, you did introduce yourself and you forgot. But assuming that hasn't happened.
I am your son. Do you not remember me, sir?
Jonathan,
we've got two questions. We may have to move your camera a bit, Simon, so it doesn't hide you completely. But Don and then Ben will know who the other LinkedIn user is, but Don's got a great question.
Okay, great. Yeah. So
lift your camera a bit, Simon, so we get a bit more of your head in. There we are. That's great.
So your charisma, humor, and engagement seem to be key parts of your personality and therefore leadership. How much of that is natural or plain you, as Viscount Slim would say? And how much have you worked to develop for these qualities?
I can't slim that. That's a quotation I might have to put in my book. So thank you for that. Look, I mean, I don't underestimate the fact that some people are inclined to be more extrovert than others. There is, that's just, that's it. I do think an exercise that is quite useful with children, having had 3 children, is that getting them all and as a family to stand up and do that just 1 minute exercise of give you a subject, how long can you stand up for and say something? Because everybody is, unless they're telling fibs, uncomfortable initially being in the public persona, making a speech in front of the class, singing a song, whatever it might be. So I'm fortunate that I am an extrovert, tons of self-doubt, but to a certain extent, go out, do your best, smile, be enthusiastic. So I would say that the enthusiasm has come, from parents who I think encouraged me to be enthusiastic. There are obviously times when you have to work it a bit when you feel, not feel very good, etc. So it's a little bit, but I do think there's another, element there, which is age and confidence. And, to a certain extent, if things, go your way, it's easier. And when you're on a dark day and things aren't so good, clearly it follows through. But I think that to the extent that one is able to say, gosh, aren't we lucky, all of us, to have to be here on this planet and to be doing things and having opportunities. And so, yeah, it's back to my generally wanting to be optimistic. Yeah. I interviewed a very interesting Russian-Australian lady on the podcast, Irina Molodtsova, and she sort of used that expression, which I like. She said, I'm an optimist. She said, when I see lemons, I think about making lemonade. So, try to be optimistic.
That's good. And we've got the other question before I go on to talk about.
Definitely.
Who's this from?
This is from James Robinson. I was just going to say that I always think with sort of public speaking and putting yourself out there, it's always like what's the worst that can happen? I mean, even if something goes wrong, people forget about it pretty quickly. So this is a question from James Robinson. And have you witnessed a shift to niceness in these turbulent times, or the opposite?
Well, that's a good question. Now, I think that I would have said up to the last couple of days that I have witnessed that, because there's a sense of shared collective experience which tends to unite. I was told by somebody in an organization yesterday that they're beginning to see sort of some irritability creep into conversations because we're headed back somewhere we didn't want to go. There's a long winter ahead, the whole debate over restrictions, etc. And so I suggested to this particular organization, why don't you just, you could put 6 in a room, and in business context, maybe more. And rather than doing this on Zoom, get them there physically, just talk about the issue. So I think that understandably there's some irritation, and it probably is going to, it'll occur in families, but in the corporate structure as well, because some people have just started going back to the office and finding a new equilibrium. So I think that there is perhaps, we're reaching an intersection.
Yeah, and building on that question, James, I think one of the other CEOs that we were interviewing said he sort of seen 3 phases. The first one was about the first 3 months from March onwards, where there was that sort of collective helping, assistance each other. You saw people applauding the NHS and delivery drivers, and everybody mucking in this sort of Dunkirk spirit. Then we sort of got to the summertime when people would try to take some kind of break. We just go anywhere on holiday. We had a staycation and we were here, but people had somewhat of a break. And now they're back into the sort of September onwards winter phase. And they know that wave 2 is probably going to be harder hit than wave 1. At least we know what's coming. And they're a bit fatigued, a bit like sort of on operational tour, 6-month tour, back to back with another 6-month tour and another 6-month tour. And this is where leaders are saying you have to have this recover and discover phase, people renewing. I don't know what your thoughts are, Simon, on those views.
Well, I think the analogy is the military analogy. You're doing these tours and coming back is good, but there's no, there isn't any respite. You can find palliatives and ways to break it up. And I do think that and I'm going to speak for the corporate world, I think that whilst understanding there may be a new order or an order that was with us for now doesn't prevent you doing some other things to, help boost morale. And there is a limit, to Zoom's or equivalent's ability to do that. So yeah, I think it's tough for tough for the old, tough for the young, tough for stuff for all of us. Yeah. But I think that there's a sense that we're going to have to get our head down and work around this. But there's definitely corona fatigue.
Yeah, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And just thinking about your life, back to your life journey, the highs and lows that you had. If you were to pick out proudest moments in your personal life and your work, and some of the darkest moments, and what you learned from those, because we all have had highs and lows, but what would be yours and the learning from them?
So I think darkest moments, I think I just touched on the one where, having built up an asset management business and to see the assets start sort of dwindling and everything going in reverse and your good offices, you take it personally. Whatever you say, whatever the reason, you take it personally. So I think that it's very, if you have a loving family around you and you're lucky enough to have that, that is a great way of defraying some of the tension. Now, for me, an absolutely essential outlet is exercise. I'm probably slightly obsessive about taking exercise, but I do find that it's just great therapy. Now, for others, it might be reading poetry or it might be dancing, but so I think that. So I guess that that was a dark moment. I had a dark moment when I was at Morgan Stanley where we got involved with a client who wanted to look at a slightly more complicated structure, and I was slightly uneasy with it. And for whatever reason, I ended up, this was pre-phones being recorded typically, but we had a call about this product and I recorded it separately on a separate recorder. 9 months later, Italy blew up within the ERM, and there was a whole sort of series of sort of problems in bond markets and currency markets. And I remember the guy then came into the meeting and he asked my boss to be there. And in front of my boss said, "Well, Simon told me I couldn't lose money," which absolutely wasn't the case. Now, I had the tape as it happened, proved not to be admissible when it went to court, was to go to court. But you are humiliated in front of your boss, at least temporarily. You feel absolutely like, you even start to question yourself. So, I remember coming home really, hanging my head sort of low and feeling sort of pretty desperate about things. But again, you just try and look through that and go, this thing will pass. And then, so those would be two that I remember particularly. I think
staying with us, Simon, this too shall pass. The old Roman emperor's whispered words from his slave behind him, or King Solomon. I think when things were good, this too shall pass, and when things were bad, this too shall pass. Do you have a sort of stoic philosophy? I'm hearing a little bit of sort of wisdom of the ages that you're using. Is this the case?
Well, I think it comes down to whether you have a propensity to be more or less optimistic. So I think that if you are more naturally optimistic, you will say, the sun will rise. And therefore you're looking through the valley and slough despond and etc. So I think that just might be easier. And of course it depends. These are very they are first world problems. They are not sort of losing your home in a tsunami and wondering how you're going to be fed. I mean, the sort of stuff that So I'm very conscious that I'm talking about something that was and also I'm going to just give a plug for somebody on another podcast called Andy Coulson. Many will remember him, and he was News of the World and etc. But he has a podcast called Crisis, What Crisis? And he interviews people who have had some really horrible episodes in their life and how they have dealt with it. And I think that's really quite inspiring. Anyway, I guess that you get on with it, and then then the chapter finishes and something else begins. So that's how I've managed it.
Yeah, great.
Proudest moments, if you want them. Look, I suppose sort of when you're at an organization and you play that actively or passively, you play that corporate game and you are involved in that corporate sort of ascendancy, and then you reach a level that you want as managing director. In my case, I did get to be the chief investment officer. You're going to be chuffed. You can't luxuriate in it, and the danger is that you do that and then you take your foot off the pedal. But yeah, it was for me that was I felt sort of very honoured. But I at a completely different level, I'm very lucky to have skied a lot, and then about 15 years ago I took up the skinning. So you go up mountains on skins, and it's quite a physical thing if you want to be. And I started doing a few endurance challenges, and then I did one particular one, the Patrouille des Glaciers, which is a transalpine one from Zermatt to Vevey overnight. It took us 16 hours. You don't stop other than to take your skins off and then to keep going. And I got the fueling wrong, and it was pretty grim in the middle of it. And I do remember we'd been going 6 hours out of Zermatt. We left at 10 o'clock at night, and the world champions, because of the Pro-Am, overtook us. I think they'd be going for 2 and a bit hours, and it was like, that's extremely humiliating. But we limped in the sort of a sunny morning to Verbier with crowds, and you've suddenly done something. It's completely out of your comfort zone. London office gym, and then there you are doing something that you weren't really shouldn't have done. Yeah, so I think that was.
Yeah,
I can tell my grandchildren about that.
Yeah.
Lovely. So one of the things we sort of find with successful people is they've often had habits which they have, which they stick with themselves consistently over time, and some of those habits have fed into their success. So we split those into three sort of areas to talk about: healthy, wealthy, and wise. So have you got any particular habits which you have to stay healthy, both mentally and physically?
So the healthy thing probably has two components. One is diet, and the other is exercise. The exercise to me, as I mentioned, I just find it my outlet. I love to exercise, and I change my exercises around depending on season, mood, bike, run. Fantastic machine in my gym called a VersaClimber, which is just can be a brutal sort of kind of endurance or cardiovascular. Anyway, so I love it. It's some fading, aging sadness that is growing within me that I need to prove something to myself. Anyway, so exercise is key. And healthy, yeah, I think when my doctor told me a few years ago, my blood pressure was up and there was some cholesterol, and I thought I ate pretty well and sort of lucky enough not to carry much weight. I really started sort of reading some of these books, how to live longer and eat healthier from the United States, from Dr. So-and-so, but, a lot of it makes sense, from Mediterranean diets to fish oil to, cutting out sort of quite a lot of dairy and other stuff. And it's sort of common sense. And it was interesting. I'm sure that lots of people will have listened already and watched. I watched that David Attenborough on Netflix released, I'm going to say planet Earth, but it isn't, but you'll know what I mean, the Earth. And, he makes some really interesting points about diet at the end more generally. But I think healthy has two components: exercise and being sensible but not obsessive about what you eat.
And just on the wealthy side, obviously, you seem to be a good person to get some advice on about that.
There might be some friends that might disagree.
And there's plenty of people who are probably struggling at the moment during these sort of tough times. Is there any good pieces of advice around money and wealth that you live your life by, or would be useful at this time?
I mean, advice is always really tricky because so many different people are at different stages. So it's going to be very general, sort of axiomatically. I think that the principle of trying to make singles, cricket analogy, singles or twos rather than hitting boundaries is relatively sensible, because accumulating wealth is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult, and when people have made it, it's actually incredibly easy for them to then sort of start being sort of if not cavalier, not very sensible about it. But I think that trying to be measured in your risk, but be prepared to take risk. Not to, and that's definitely a mistake that I have made. This sort of cognitive dissonance where you believe your own sort of conversation, or you only read the stuff that reinforces your own views. And I've been incredibly guilty of that. So to listen to others, not that you should rely overly, because common sense and judgment plays a part, but being prepared to weigh up why you could be wrong. And I think it was, again, I'm conscious I'm going to use a second military analogy, but I think General Patton said, if you're all thinking the same way, then nobody's thinking. And there is that sense that, the obvious, when the Economist, I gave a talk the other day, and in 1987, Fortune had, 1982, Fortune had a magazine cover, The Death of Equities, which of course was the start of the most extraordinary 20-year bull market. And in 2007, might have wrong, General Electric, the best company in the world, and that was where the stock was at its high point before it collapsed 80%. So, we've got to be a little bit careful about, I am a contrarian investor. I think that I think we have an inflation, that will emerge, because that's how governments deal with these policies. I could bore lots of people with why I like certain investments. This isn't the forum to do that, but take advice. Diversification makes sense, but do some work yourselves. Try and figure out. But of all the pieces of advice, I suppose one of the greats. And I'm going to think of Warren Buffett, but actually it wasn't. It was somebody in Fidelity. He's gone from mine. But he said that his most valuable day as an investor was on Saturday. So on Saturday he went out and he went to shops and he saw what people were buying and he observed, these trends, and he could see if a store was doing well, if a product was selling. Now, difficult in this world. But it's amazing how many times I remember when the Apple iPod came out. I mean, Apple had been nearly bust. People forget. The iPod transformed Apple's fortunes.
Mm.
And I got one. It's like, and then, well, why didn't I buy the stock? Now we know Apple's journey has been extraordinary, but how often do we actually see something, test it, or our children might use it, see it, like it, and just one can pause, because investing is about buying good quality companies at a sensible price and staying with them.
Nice. And I was going to ask you for maybe a piece of wisdom that you try and live your life by. I don't know if you've got another piece of wisdom, but because the last one was was pretty good.
Look, enthusiasm, persistence, humor, hard work.
Lovely.
Very good. And then let's go on to, obviously the theme is inspiring leadership. We could talk about inspiring leaders and team, but I'd rather you perhaps talk about maybe on your own podcast, the MoneyMaze podcast, which you don't have to plug because I'll plug it. I think it's and would there be a couple of people that you found inspiring on there that you think are, you want to call them out as being good, inspiring leaders who've led good teams and have the right kind of character, values, integrity that you admire?
Yes, I mean, we have been lucky enough already in our short existence to have some fantastic people on. So I'm going to suggest two people who I've been particularly struck by. One was a German lady called Dr. Christina Maguire. She came on the podcast, and she has gone from a doctor who practiced in Papua New Guinea to give up her career to go to Goldman Sachs, to go to Harvard Business School. Goldman Sachs runs an asset management firm, and went to Harvard Business School as a single mother with a 6-month-old child, I think. Very, very inspiring. Dr. Christina Maguire. Secondly, Helen Watson. She is the chief executive of Rothschild Wealth Management in the UK. I've known her for 30 years. It's one of the reasons that I am, an advisor there. But just a really great example of how to motivate people, build a successful business, get on with things without a lot of fuss, and and enjoy the journey. So she's another really, really inspiring person.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And let's go on to Ben with sort of topics about COVID and things like that. Maybe we'll sort of ask a few questions about COVID. Just lost you, Ben. You're on mute. Ben?
Yeah, there we go. So for you, Simon, what's the sort of impact been during the COVID crisis, both personally and professionally?
Well, I think personally, the corona upside was having 3 children, and we were all together in Devon for the lockdown, and it wasn't the outcome I think any of my children wanted, but I think for my wife and myself, it was the ability to have just a lot of conversations that we might not otherwise have had, and to be together for a long time, and not without, of course, it's sort of, mercurialism. There were some highs and lows, along that. But that was the personal perspective. From a business perspective, we know that this sort of whole podcasting sort of journey, for anybody who does podcasts, has come at the right time. I think from an investing standpoint, it's been highly complicated, because if you had been told that the world was going to essentially be infected with a plague that would shut down, and governments would do what they've never done, shut down the demand and the supply side of the economies. We can track plagues. It's never happened before. And then to have said that what that has done to multiple industries would not have which has led to recession, probably depression, and yet stock markets in places like the US making all-time highs, you would have said, well, I simply don't understand that. The disconnect between the real world and the financial world and that's flawed many of us. You can argue why Microsoft, Google, etc., the 5 that now are a quarter of the Standard & Poor's 500, terms of their market representation, you can understand why they have benefited. But there's some stuff that is difficult to understand. There is of course, a vast amount of money creation. So I think it's been pretty tricky. I mean, very tricky to manage money through this, particularly if you're inclined as an investor to be what they call a value investor. So you'd like to buy companies that appear to be cheap intrinsically or relative to their sort of future earnings. So, being an investor in this has been really hard.
Yeah, very hard. Yeah, we've got one comment on the feed about that, and someone who listens to the show quite regularly, Venkat's just looking for some advice for someone just starting out in investment and savings. Where should one start?
Wow. It's a great question, because where should one start? I mean, start by saving, and I don't think you need to be in a hurry to get invested. I think as you build a portfolio, and it depends on where you are in your life. If you're 25, your time horizon hopefully is exceptionally long. If you're 70, it's different. In the very old days, they used to say the fixed income or the bond weight in a portfolio should be equal to your age. So at 56, you might have 56% in bonds. Bonds yield nothing. They are, essentially, I think, worthless. They're pieces of debt issued by governments that are, increasingly sitting on precarious finances. But I think that as you build the companies around the world that you may like, or the funds, do your research, as I said earlier on. And I think gradually committing some money to some of those companies, you may find you're doing your online shopping through one of the online grocers, and that Sainsbury's, Tesco, for example, too, have been through 20-year bear markets, and their stock prices are down now 60% still from the highs of a decade ago. Now, you may decide that you like the business, you may not. You may equally decide there are others. But I think beginning to following companies that you like, and you can go online, you can read their reports, you can see how they're describing their business. There's a lot of sort of public information, and starting, I think, little by little, gain experience. You'll make mistakes. What you learn from that. You just want to avoid the classic investment trap, which is, sell low, buy high.
Yeah, which has been easy to do in this this crazy market this year, with everything fluctuating so much, I think.
Yeah, and really sort of picking up that point on COVID and what's going on. The one thing about the future is it's very uncertain, and no one can predict it. But in what you're reading about markets and what's going on, you were touching on this before, and it's fascinating. What do you think will be happening to our economy? And, we've got people like, I'm self-employed, so is my wife. We've both got our own limited company. We have no help from the government. We can get ourselves a bounce back loan to increase it by £50,000, but there's not much help for the smaller business. What do you think is going to be happening to different kinds of businesses in, 2021 and going on? How would you predict it? And how are leaders going to handle the way that some of their businesses are not breathing anymore or are bleeding to death? What's your view?
Like I said, two questions there, aren't there? In terms of the easier one is, how does it look? The answer is tough, depending on your business. I was looking at some data. I mean, global tourism and travel is 10% of the global economy, and for some countries higher. If you're sitting there in those businesses, it's pretty bleak, and you are obviously going to hope that you have enough cash to ride out the storm, which will pass, because with or without a vaccine, and somebody rightly said it's not the vaccines that matter but the vaccinations. So there will be people who are resistant to taking them, who won't simply won't want to take the vaccines, but we will pass through this, and there will be a resumption of life as normal, but not quite as we knew it, because there are going to be all these nuances about sort of office practices, etc. But will people travel? Yes. Will they travel as often? Who knows? But I guess that I am, the economic cycle is exactly that. And the authorities are trying to manage the downside as best they can. But of course, every country is different. So again, your question, John, is a UK-centric question. I think UK and Europe are mature economies. They have accumulated large stocks of debt. That makes it difficult for them to grow. The simple answer to hiking taxation, I think, would be a mistake. People need to be incentivized to create businesses and to get tax treatment that encourages them to take risk. And people need to be really to think about how can they start businesses, and our education system should evolve to encourage more of the innovation and technology, maybe more than it has. So I think it's going to be tough, period. I think that if you're sitting there in other parts of the world, you may think that in Asia, I'm thinking about where half the world's population sits, there's growth that will happen because you've got younger populations, aspirational populations in many countries, Vietnam to India. And why should you be long-term pessimistic? I don't think you should. But I think that absent the training or education that allows you to get into workplaces on ladders, it's damn difficult. And to answer your second part of the question, which is how the authority is dealing with this, well, there are lots of different ways in different countries that is being approached. So, in terms of the UK specific, Rishi Sunak's sort of approach, I'm not seeking to be political, but I think he has an awareness of economic dynamics, which is helpful. It's clearly not, you can't make everybody happy all the time because you are balancing, and he was on one of those key committees yesterday, I think, when they were announcing some of these new restrictions. He gets the economic cost is appalling. There's a debate about the Swedish model versus ours, and we don't want to get into it today, but it is not the norm to shut down economies and collapse demand and collapse supply, because that is the road to ruin. And therefore there has to be a trade-off in understanding that a death toll related to coronavirus is inevitable. And I think the data as of last week was the coronavirus is the 23rd killer in the UK. So there are 22 other things killing people more than COVID right now. And so I would argue that we need to be doing everything we can to be economically supportive. And it won't please everybody, but I think that means that there should be more rather than less liberalism vis-a-vis the locking down.
Yeah. It's such a difficult balancing act, like you say. It's you can't please everyone, and the whole politicizing a lot of these decisions has made it even tougher, I think, for a lot of people in that position. You mentioned some of the changes that might sort of continue after COVID. What do you think some of those changes might be, and how do you think they're going to impact leadership and teams of the future?
Well, I think the idea that everybody who can in the service sector is always from now on is going to work from home is unrealistic. If you are a younger person, how do you really get inspired? How do you learn other than by watching people in practice? How do you get motivation? Sure, you may work a day or two, but you need to be alongside people who have done it, who say, who take you into the meeting, who you see make mistakes and who you can suggest and debate and discuss. And so that's why I think that it's too simple an assumption to assume that so we're all going to work from home most of the time. I think the office may clearly have it's the service sector I'm talking about, may have more of a rotation, but I think that we'll see a gravitation to a model where more people are working from the office than not, and it's that building culture. So I think that's to me that's pretty important. Zooms are great up to a point, but they have their downsides. I mean, look, COVID is accelerating lots of existing trends. I mean, I think the number, I'm going to maybe get this wrong, but was it certainly sub 20% of people did their grocery shopping online pre-COVID, and we know that number's going up. I mean, those were so there are trends that have been accelerated. There are industries that were struggling that maybe their end has been hastened. And that's so sunset and sunrise industries. What can the government do to encourage the sunrise? Will people travel as they did. I was quite surprised. I read a piece of research yesterday that said that right now, even if it was safe, 80% of Americans wouldn't get on a plane. Now, I have flown actually a couple of times in the last few months, and because it was a bit odd, Heathrow was deserted, and you wear your mask, etc. But you got again back to touching 8 billion people in the world, and people want to see the Colosseum, and they might need to think that going to Frankfurt allows them to, seal the deal. And so I am not persuaded that some of these things are not going to resurface. They will resurface in different ways. But are there airlines in Europe that were shocking? I mean, without wanting to castigate a number of them, there are lots of European airlines, legacy carriers that were not a great experience. And maybe they shouldn't exist, because maybe some of the Ryanairs and the EasyJets, and others who have a business model that is different will survive. They don't have pensions that they have to support, and lots of legacy issues. But so I think you're going to see a reordering now. You're going to get a reordering of supply chains, because you don't want to be reliant upon, not this time it's masks, but it'll be something else. You don't want it to come from China. You might want it to come from Turkey. So is there a reordering of supply chains? I am sure that's right. Is there some cost associated with that? I'm sure there will be, to my point that there will be inflation. But there are going to be some strategic decisions which may not stack up when analysed through the cold lens of a P&L, but part of that is a touch of the deglobalization. It's been a tailwind to outsource to low-cost employment destinations. And that was fine. And China was already finding that it wasn't a low-cost destination. Like Mexico's cheaper on average hourly, so I think unskilled worker than China. But you're seeing those changes, and I think that that's going to be a combination. The question really is, and that's a sort of geopolitical question, is does this strain further the tensions between China and the West, and does it lead to the erection of boundaries and sort of a me first style attitude?
Well, that brings me on to a completely different question. Thinking back to your days at the LSE when you were up there on stage with Heseltine. So, what are you making of how the Conservatives are handling things at the moment? I think Rishi Sunak's doing a good job, but how's Boris getting on? And will Keir Starmer provide an interesting alternative? He's certainly got more credibility and scoring better in the polls. And then the other one, which I'll add as a little secondary question, Trump versus Biden, who do you think is going to win? So those are a couple of political questions which flip in there.
Okay, so there was I thought, a very measured article in today's Telegraph by Haig, former leader of the Conservative Party, talking about why you should probably recognise what's worked, but what also is working, or what the Conservatives are doing. And he has some quite good data about just how many tests are taking place and just how much progress has been made in certain areas that would have seemed unlikely. So I thought it was quite balanced, and he has been a critic at times in Boris. Look, my view is that, firstly, that Boris was elected for a number of reasons, and getting through the EU withdrawal was absolutely front and centre stage. And then the combination of him being hit by COVID and nearly dying, and being advised by the medical academic community that it was Armageddon, sort of has hastened him into it, or pushed him into a position with which he wouldn't have been naturally comfortable, i.e. more rather than less lockdown. And so I think the incompetencies and the poor or unclear decision making that we have seen, it's not unique to this government, but it's disappointing. There are 4 and a bit years, aren't there, to run, or 4 years to run until the next next election. A lot can happen and a lot can change. And I think that if we get an exit arrangement that we might well do before year end, and even if we don't, then we're forced to trade on WTO rules without being very boring. That's how Europe trades with China and the US. It works. As one economist noted the other day, relative to COVID, UK leaving without a trade agreement is a minor likely impediment to GDP relative to the size of COVID. But I think there will be. My guess is that a deal is done. So that then leads to that very interesting question, Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer is the voice of reason, and it's very nice to listen to somebody leading the Labour Party who suggests that immense polarity in British politics that was deeply unhealthy and that was represented by Corbyn as the face of extremism with which we are not familiar in this country has started to narrow. But I would hasten people to not believe that Keir Starmer is representative of the wider Labour movement, because whilst the Labour MPs, remember, did not support Corbyn and voted for him to be ousted, the Labour Party, the wider Labour Party, which has been hijacked by momentum, is deeply antithetical to many things that we would regard as normal, from private ownership through to levels of taxation, through to all sorts of things. So Starmer may be the face of a more reasonable Labour Party, and that is to be welcome. But I fear that underneath it, and we've seen one of the unions, I think Unite, pulling support from him, financial support to put towards more left-leaning organisations, the schism within the Labour Party is not done. So long time to go till the next election. Lots of fault lines within the Labour Party. The Conservatives need to remember, you creating jobs creates wealth. I'm going to just finish with my last quotation, which was, what did Churchill say about the socialists versus the Conservatives? Socialists believed in the queue, the Conservatives believed in the ladder.
Nice, some very good quotes that you've given us today. So we're on our last couple of minutes. So final couple of questions, just for you personally, what would you like your legacy to be?
Okay. I think grand, really successful people have legacies. I don't think the chap from Bristol, should have. There's no legacy to be written about me. But I think that if you made the most of your opportunities and created those as well along the way, and recognized that luck has a huge part to play. I think if you've inspired a few and you have been lucky enough to create a family and instill them with things that you think matter, laughed with a lot of people, and shared love, friendship, then you might say, well, that would make me happy.
Definitely. And final question: have you got a book recommendation, either something that's that sort of touched your life, or even just something you picked up during lockdown that's been good entertainment?
Okay, so no military history books, although I do read quite a lot of them. Bad Blood is the story of Theranos and the extraordinary scandal, and it's brilliant. So that was number one. A little bit more serious, but I think it's great, is A Short History of Europe, written by Simon Jenkins, and it really does, in 300 pages, 400 pages, maybe less, condense Europe's fragmented, fractured, argumentative sort of, past and potentially future, really nicely. And then the one I was given by this co-founder of the MoneyMaze Podcast, Will Campion, which is a really good book. I'm going to say it's Richard Reed. I may have that wrong, but it's called If You Could Tell Me Just One Thing. And I'm reading that book, and I think it is absolutely fantastic. And I'm going to give it to people as Christmas presents. So
brilliant. And I am going to, before we go off air, in that question I asked you, Trump versus Biden.
Yes.
Where do you think it's going to go?
Yeah.
I think sitting here in the UK with secondhand information, I don't know. I'm very lucky. So next week I'm going to interview for Rothschild's Mr. Anthony Scaramucci.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I got to tell you, we're going to have a very interesting conversation. I know that for a fact.
That is going to be fascinating. Yeah.
He's gone from press spokesman for Trump to Biden supporter. With the heavy caveat that sitting here, what can I really expect to say? We can see the polls, and the polls, of course, may not show us how many people just don't want to tell you they'll vote for Trump.
Yeah.
But I think Biden will get it. And then the more interesting thing is as the Democrats got control of the houses, and if they do, then we could see some quite marked changes. But I think it's extraordinary that yet again the US produces such potential leaders of such mediocrity. and that is extraordinary, and it's not a good reflection on the US's wealth in the real term of wealth. But my money, I guess, would be that Biden wins it.
Well, Simon, it's been an absolute joy having you on. You've had some great feedback in the margins of things. Ben and I know, have loved it, and the banter has been fabulous. Thank you very much indeed. Stay with us. We're just going to go off air, but thank you for being on the series.
Yeah,
thank you. And thank you for everybody who's listened. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Simon.